Okay, good morning. The paper I'm going to give today is it was the beginning and ending, quite literally, of my most recent book. So back in 2006, while I was just starting my PhD, my supervisor, Alexandra Walsham, said, "There's this great little manuscript in the folder Shakespeare, go check it out." And I took her quite literally, jumped on a flight to Washington, D.C. the next week, and found this. It's a 9-page letter from one Catholic cousin to his Protestant cousin. And it is now the last chapter in my most recent book that came out a few weeks ago, which, if I don't say this, my wife will put my head on a spit. If you would like more information about the book, I have flyers, which my wife printed out and gave to me and said, "Go sell your book." So there we go. I'm not very good at self-promotion. All right. The title for my paper comes from this intriguing manuscript in the folder Shakespeare collection, and it provides a unique look into a private debate between an anonymous English Catholic author and his cousin, who is evidently a Protestant, in the early days of the reign of Charles I. In this manuscript letter, the Catholic author runs us through a defense of image devotion and a rebuttal against the standard Protestant polemic about Catholic idolatry. The phrase, "Christ Jesus is an idol," is an effort on the part of the Catholic author to demonstrate the absurdity, both as linguistic error and a hypocritical farce, of the Protestant attack. By many people's accounts, including the late historian of Elizabethan England, Patrick Collinson, the debate over religious images in England was settled, or at least permanently and irredeemably unsettled, by 1600. The narrative commonly asserts that while Queen Elizabeth was ambiguous concerning images, particularly her own personal chapel cross, by the 1580s, and certainly by 1600, the matter of religious images in England was all but dried up. The battle lines were as permanent and immovable as the Western Front in World War I. In fact, Anthony Milton, in his study of Stuart England, has offered one of the very few analyses of the image debate after 1603, arguing that while Rome's formal doctrine of image worship was condemned by Protestants, there was a large field of rhetorical dispute where Catholics and Protestants continued to meet. This manuscript letter provides evidence for the picture that Milton has presented. Far from determined, the Catholic author seems convinced that this one issue provides a tactical jumping-off point to assault the broader forms of Protestant theology. Now, before we get into the debate over religious images, let's set the stage just a little bit, talking about the manuscript itself. It's dated from May 1625, and is written in a single hand. The manuscript itself is in very good condition. You can still go see it at the Folger, but the paper lacks any discernible watermark. The letter contains several of the author's own deletions and additions to the text, and while it is not evident that this is a rough draft, there's also no evidence that the letter was ever sealed or delivered. The Catholic author explains the use of religious images, particularly the cross, and he defends the tradition set out by the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. Delivering a rebuttal that is built upon long-standing arguments as well as innovative rhetorical terms. Writing to his Protestant cousin, the author delivers a letter peppered with personal sentiments alongside a unique synthesis of Catholic writings dating back to Thomas Aquinas. Over the course of the letter, the author draws on Thomas More's debates with William Tyndale, as well as the polemical wars between Protestant bishops and Catholic priests in the early Elizabethan years, and finally, the early Stuart contests over the questions of religious authority. When it comes to the question of the author's identity, I'm afraid I haven't come up with a viable candidate. Although he does reveal a few interesting nuggets about himself and his reader, there's nothing that definitively points in any one direction. For example, it is clear that the author is a Welsh Catholic. He knows the Welsh language, and nobody but the Welsh know the Welsh. And his Protestant cousin is a parson, or at least he identifies him as such, meaning that he's a clergyman in the Protestant church. And both of them have connections either to the royal court or to Parliament in the 1590s. He claims to have borne witness to the trial and execution of the traitor John Perrott in 1592, and by his own admission, he remains a royalist loyal to Charles I. Not Perrott, the author. I have suggested elsewhere that he may have been educated at a Catholic-friendly Oxford college like Jesus College, which was well known for both its Welsh and Catholic students. However, one of the English Catholic colleges on the continent, in Rome or in Douai, is equally possible. The college at Rome, in fact, was run by a Welshman in the 1570s, so this may have attracted our author. It is also possible that he was involved in one of the many Welsh recusant groups scattered around the countryside. Nor should we discount the possibility that he is a late convert to the old religion, somewhere after 1590, and has since gone into exile, because almost all of the historical references in the manuscript occur pre-James 1603. But as far as, that's about as far as we go with his biography. Now, in terms of the historical context of the letter, it is written on the closing days of what Michael Questier has described as a period of fitful royal tolerance, in which James I had relaxed anti-Catholic policies during his efforts to barter marriage alliances with Spain and then France. Puritan anxieties about King Charles and his newly acquired French Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria, exacerbated fears of a Catholic renewal in England in 1625. In such tumultuous times, unpublished and private documents like the Catholic letter can offer useful counterpoints to much of the published vitriolic polemic that is typical of the day. It can also give us insights into how confessional boundaries were constructed. Where were these boundaries drawn? How were they crossed? Were they crossed? And how were personal and professional relationships maneuvered around them? For we know that Protestants and Catholics had these relationships with one another. The general tone of the letter does not easily fit into any existing category of early modern polemic. At first glance, the manuscript resembles the published conversion letters of students and priests on the continent. However, the Folger manuscript lacks the pathetic pleas and overdone sentimentality that typify this genre. In some respects, the letter resembles the kind of moderate rhetoric that has been identified among certain Protestants, particularly the Arminians like John Dove and Edmund Bunny. The several basic elements of the letter support this assertion. The simple nomenclature of cousin is a sympathetic and familiar one, and he uses it continually throughout the letter. Also within the argument, there is a definite effort to minimize the difference between the two men, as the author refers to their dispute as only one point of disagreement, that is, only a seeming difficulty. Third, the author discourages the use of what he refers to as discourteous terms and unmannerly language, promising his reader that after their debate has passed, he desires to continue to be good friends. Finally, rather than finishing with an ultimate polemical thrust, the end of the letter, at least the very end of the letter, returns to their shared theological foundation, quoting the Athanasian Creed. This is strong evidence, but it is not conclusive. Certainly, the author is unwavering in his charity towards his cousin. But unlike a lot of the moderate rhetoric that is circulating, he is open and honest about his distaste for the contradictions and internal inconsistencies of the Protestants. The author is not immune from name-calling either. Protestant preachers in the letter are rabble, prating, and full of lewd and lying hyperbole. While it is tempting to find an existing category within which we can more easily understand the letter, we should avoid pigeonholing it also as something that is less than vindictive. Taken on its own merits, the Catholic letter requires us to expand our current categories and boundaries of cross-confessional polemic. It is both an adamant statement of Catholic doctrine, unflinching in its attacks on Protestants, and at the same time a charitable excursus in which the charity is not contingent upon the reader's conversion. Okay, our stage is set. Let's get on to the debate. Now, perhaps the most fundamental disagreement between Protestant and Catholics over idolatry was to define exactly what an idol is. There were several factors that could and did play a role in this definition. Location, size, the subject being represented, whether there was color involved, whether it was a statue or a painting. However, the battle over definition became very quickly one of linguistics, particularly the translation of keywords in Scripture, namely the Greek words eidolon and icon, and the Latin term imago. Ever since Thomas More's theological entanglements with William Tyndale, the Catholic discourse on images regularly stressed the Protestant mistranslation of the words imago and eidolon. As the author states, the self-same word eidolon is in some of their Bibles translated images, and sometimes idols. The Protestant theologian Peter Vermigli had accurately explained the matter in his Loci Communis, saying, idols are also images, the word derived from eidos, and eidos is a likeness, image, or form, whereupon comes eidolon. So it was not as though Protestants were ignorant of the matter. In fact, no one disputed the point, at least as far as it went. But it didn't go far enough in explaining how you go from eidos in Greek to an English distinction between image and idol. Even among Protestants, exactly how and where this gulf was to be bridged was hotly debated. There's a great difference between what William Tyndale will call an image and what Calvinists like William Perkins at the end of the 16th century will call an image. At the heart of this squabble was the translation of the English Bible. For the Protestant translation of Scripture in the 1530s had been equally ambiguous about how to tell the difference. The popular preacher of the 1540s, Roger Edgeworth, railed against the Protestant abuses of images, saying they would have that this Latin term imago signify an idol, and so these new translations of the English Bibles have it in all places, where the translators would bring men to believe that to set up images or to have images is idolatry. While it was unclear how Protestant translations made this distinction, sometimes translating image and sometimes idol, the Catholic parameters for idolatry were clear. The priest Nicholas Sanders, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, wrote a book, a treatise on the images of Christ, and he sets down the basic Catholic distinction. Is every image an idol, or is every idol an image? Every image, if it be properly an image, keyword, is the likeness of some truth, that is, something that exists. But know you not the difference between an idol and an image? Then you are very simple, in good faith, and too meanly learned. I guess that says enough. Perhaps the most damaging Catholic polemic along these lines was Gregory Martin's book, A Discovery of the Manifold Corruptions of Holy Scripture, published in Reims in 1582. While he's translating the Douay-Rheims Bible, Martin took great pains to identify where various Protestant translations were in error. And this is what he has to say on the subject of images. Do they tell you that image and idol are so all one? That wherever you find this word image, you may truly call it idol? For these are the points that you should defend in your answer. For an example, do they teach you to translate in these places, thus, God has predestined us to be made conformable to the idol of his Son? And again, as we have borne the idol of the earthly Adam, so let us bear the idol of the heavenly Christ. And again, we are transformed into the same idol, even as of our Lord's Spirit. And again, the law having a shadow of the good things to come, not the very idol of the things. And again, Christ, who is the idol of the invisible God. Is this, I pray you, a true translation? Now, some Protestants actually recognize the problem. The Hebrew scholar Hugh Broughton, as well as Archbishop Matthew Parker, at least publicly recognized the linguistic shortcomings of the translations. However, the Catholic author believed such errors were less an issue of ill-equipped translators and more, as Margaret Aston has described it, a crafty misconstruction. This is apparent in the Catholic author's example of the mistranslation of the mid-century Welsh New Testament by the Protestant theologian William Morgan, that is, mid-16th century. Morgan's initial New Testament wrongly translated the popular passage in the book of Hebrews about Abraham's justification. Morgan's translation read, Abraham was justified by his faith, changing the key word works to faith. Thus, in Morgan's translation, Abraham was justified by his faith, as all good Protestants want to be, rather than his actions in demonstrating his willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac. Since earlier Welsh translations had dealt with the passage appropriately, that is, translating it works, and there were not any delicate linguistic distinctions between the Welsh words, and I'll just give you my very poor Welsh pronunciation here, feed, which is faith, and weithredoedd. I mean, they have a few letters in common, not really. Feed and weithredoedd, you can't really confuse them. There were no delicate linguistic distinctions between them as there were between idolum and imago. The Catholic author concludes that this was done simply to confirm the Protestant, and I'm quoting here, corruption of the means of justification. Now, in the image debate, how images were treated could have just as much impact upon the definition of idolatry as some physical aspect of the image. That is, was it worshipped? Was it treated like an idol? The Catholic distinction between types of worship, what Thomas Aquinas referred to as dulia, that is, worship of civil things, and latria, devotion belonging only to God, became a great point of contention amongst Protestants and Catholics. Protestants as early as the Continental Reformer Martin Bucer in the late 1520s dismissed such a distinction as mere Catholic dissimulation. Of course, Protestants were not without their own distinctions, and Catholic discourse made quick use of them as evidence of Protestant hypocrisy. In the Folger manuscript alone, the author identifies several ways that Protestants used images. They kissed their Bibles. They showed reverence to the signs of the monarchy, the scepter, the crown, the portrait of the monarch. These are kissed, bowed to, and knelt before. The Catholic author asks his cousin simply, will you need bow with reverence to the dead picture of a temporal queen, Elizabeth, and rail at us for doing reference to the image of Christ? However, there were more problematic examples that Catholics could point toward. Protestants put pictures in their books. In fact, many of the kinds of representations that they were ripping down from Catholic churches were to be found in Protestant printed books throughout the 16th and 17th century. Images of Christ, God the Father, the Virgin, and various biblical figures. Some of the pictures even represented pagan figures. Nicholas Sander again mocks the Bishop of Salisbury, John Jewel, because several of his theological treatises came complete with woodcuts of what Sander calls antiques and gorgons. And he that hath pulled down Christ's image and the sign of his healthful cross in all churches and chapels sets forth unto us a most bawdy spectacle. And he goes on, if the printer had brought Jewel the blessed sign of Christ's humanity spread upon the cross, he would have stormed at him not a little and have caused him to have mended the text. But apparently pagan images are fine. In 1606, the Catholic priest Robert Chambers jumped on this bandwagon, attacking John Fox's Acts and Monuments, saying, he has set them out the pictures of his martyrs, and his people may gaze upon them. Wycliffe, Luther, Huss, Melanchthon, Calvin, all to be sold and hanged up in everyone's house without any peril of idolatry. The images of Protestant reformers in places of reverence was perhaps the most difficult to swallow for Catholics, particularly as Catholic saints were being jettisoned from the churches. This is the image that the Catholic author picks upon. Just a few years before the letter is written, Dr. Gervase Babington, the Bishop of Worcester, had passed away, and his complete works came out in 1623 with a nice picture of Babington and a nice Latin text below commending the bishop. And here the author jumps. Tell me ingenuously whether a modest Protestant has not more cause to blush on in your behalf of their brethren or fathers, the prelates of their church, who rudely suppressing and often irreligiously abusing the picture of Christ, have the faith notwithstanding to permit their own practices, or their brethren to set out in public view to be respected with such blasphemous praises, annexed thereunto in print of the persons represented, as this that which follows in particular, expressed in a fair brazen stamp. The accompanying Latin lines proclaimed Babington. So the little Latin lines at the bottom, I know you probably can't make them out. Basically proclaims Babington to have been the best of men, the most honorable, the most respected clergyman. The author retorts, what, was there never better men? What was St. Paul? John the Baptist? What about Jesus? Were not these prelates and preachers? Or maybe they were just babies. Toward the end of the letter, the author combines the dulia latria debate with the debate over the Greek and Latin words to suggest that Protestants are guilty of both hypocrisy and ineptitude, saying, but all the professors of the Protestant religion in England do in that manner give true latria to an idol. Since Christ is the icon of the Father, as it says in Colossians 1, and Protestants worship Christ with latria, then as the author concludes, if their principles be true, they commit most palpable idolatry. They worship an icon. In the last 2 pages of the letter, the author hoists his Protestant cousin's arguments on the sword of authority by questioning the veracity of English Bible translations. He concludes his polemic with a common rhetorical turn, using one issue, that is the reverence of images, to speak about a much larger matter, namely the Protestant doctrine of sola scriptura. Following this, the author challenged the theological authority of the Reform movement by asking, what certainty do you have? That is to say, now that it is clear that English Bibles are in error, what can you put your trust in? And I love this phrase, I pity much your case, who acknowledging upon earth no infallible authority to declare for certain what edition or translation of your Bible is authentically true, and to be taken for God's own word, are guided each one of you by his own private spirit, making of the one side the scripture to be the only rule of faith, to define and decide all controversies, and of the other side, coining what scripture you please, partly by corrupting the words and partly by interpreting them according to everyone's private fancy. Unfortunately, we don't have the Protestants' response, because I'd love to hear it. The arguments against Catholic idolatry, namely the condemnation of idols in Scripture, has been turned on its head, transforming it into a weapon against the foundations of the Protestant Reformation. But what I think is evident from the letter is that the Catholic cause in England was most certainly alive and well into the 17th century, still contesting, still engaging, and still in some instances besting their Protestant counterparts. Moreover, it is clear that the conversation and discourse over this matter of images, albeit well-trodden ground, was not bereft of innovation and evolution. Finally, it is important to keep in mind that this letter represents a kind of relationship that we rarely have the opportunity to see in the pre-modern world, that of the cross-confessional and intimate friendship. Whatever their dispute, the author concludes as he began his letter in a charitable tone, and here's where I'll end. I desire to find you, as you will always find me, an assured friend. Thank you.
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. So we may have time for a couple of questions just right now. We may, at the end of our period, have more time for questions. Is there anything that anybody needs to bring up just right this second? Oh, yes, sir, please.
I have a sort of a comment. This is an indication of the value of education. These men were literate, right? Number one. Number two, they knew their adversary and reached out to them, as opposed to others who were ready to start wars over things like this, who didn't know their adversary and who didn't really understand the full context. And so I think that just shows you that in today's world, maybe we can be more tolerant because we know more, because we've been taught it.
That's the point. Thank you for that.
One never sees, I was interested to find this picture of J.R.R. Tolkien, because there he is in the army, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, as you know, served in combat, and there's how we usually see a picture. But those of you who are astute editors will notice that the title is shortened, and that's just so I can get it on the slide. I'm still going to give you 20 minutes from the same paper. So you'll get a little bit of Aristotle as well as Tolkien. So deep roles in the tropes of J.R.R. Tolkien and Beowulf criticism. J.R.R. Tolkien explored the Old English epic poem Beowulf critically and imaginatively. Critically, he wrote first a commentary based on lecture notes selected and edited by Christopher Tolkien. Second, an introductory essay on translating the epic poem into prose. Third, a modern English prose translation. And fourth, an influential thematic essay, Beowulf, the Monsters, and the Critics. Imaginatively, he wrote 2 ballads or lays on Beowulf for singing, 2 versions of a hypothetical folk tale, conjuring up how the earliest oral sources of Beowulf might have been told and elaborated. In addition, he composed a partial translation of Beowulf in alliterative verse, which remains unpublished. Here we have a tapestry, and this is a modern reconstruction. So they increased the sounding board to have it sound. I imagine this is probably closer than the tapestry to what it looked like. Okay. Anglo-Saxon harp. All right, I'm going to go through a series of definitions, which I hope you will be able to tolerate. To make it a little more interesting, I've placed 2 irrelevant and false statements in here. And so as I'm going through this, you can sort of keep your eye on for the irrelevant and false statements. When I get to after I read it, however, just to make sure that everybody realizes that it's irrelevant and false, I will do, now this is not a political criticism, so don't be offended. I will do my interpretation of Jeb Bush. All right, trope. A trope is a conversion of a word or phrase from its proper signification to another in order to increase its force and rhetorical eloquence, as Quintilian defines it. A trope is a figure of speech that employs a word or phrase to signify something other than its conventional meaning. Tropes transfer new connotations to referential terms, reshaping meaning and emphasis. When a trope is based on an analogy, a compound sentence of comparison with 4 or more terms, it is metaphoric. When it is based on terms within one simple sentence, it is metonymic or synecdoche. Role analysis. Role analysis of deep verbs and deep cases in tropes reveals imaginative structures and semantic categories that underline and energize language and literature. Insights from deep role analysis of tropes and other figures of thought may well facilitate the composition of imaginative figures and literary criticism. Such analysis of Tolkien's critical and imaginative explorations of Beowulf provide a glimpse into the figurative artistry and of the Anglo-Saxon author of Beowulf and the creative imagination of J.R.R. Tolkien. Here we have an example of the Beowulf manuscript, which I'm glad I didn't have to read it in that format. Here we have a dragon on a tower, but I guess you didn't really have to say that. This could be Beowulf's nemesis. It could also be the dragon hobbit, possibly, or it might even be the dragon from Harry Potter series. but actually, maybe they all are the same direction. This is a fuzzy picture of a woodcut of the death of Beowulf. Okay. Analogy. An analogy is a comparison of at least two or more, because these are all tropes we're doing. Analogy is a comparison of at least two or more relationships in a compound sentence. The following paraphrase of an analogy, which was cited by Aristotle in the Poetics and on Rhetoric, illustrate the four basic forms of analogies. First, an analogy with two nouns and a linking verb in each sentence. Dionysius is to the wine bowl as Ares is to the shield. Second, an analogy with noun and adjective terms. Ares is as excessive as Dionysus is. Excessive, because we usually don't say that, but logically it's there. Or Ares is as furious as Bacchus is tipsy. Third, an analogy with a noun and action verb. Ares infuriates as Dionysus inebriates. Finally, an analogy with a noun, action verb, and adverb terms. Ares fights as excessively as Dionysus drinks. Understood excessively or excessively. Ares fights as furiously as Bacchus drinks excessively. Okay, imaginative analogy. An imaginative analogy, which is the basis for metaphor, similes, and personification, contains a referential sentence and an imaginative sentence. To define it another way, an imaginative analogy is an extended simile with at least four terms, which are symbolized by the letter A is to B, as C is to D, in notational tradition going back to Aristotle. Using a paraphrase of a passage from Homer, a passage which was also paraphrased by Aristotle in his discussion of metaphor and simile, a good example of analogy with four terms is the sentence, Achilles is to Aeneas as a lion is to an adversary. Simile. A simile, like a metaphor or personification, is an imaginative comparison that functions as an element in the surface structure of a sentence. The surface form of a simile must contain first, a lexical word or phrase for the reference of the simile, second, an explicit structure word or phrase of comparison, such as like, as plus comparative adjective or comparative adverb, or the way. And third, an imaginative word or phrase with different connotations from a category of thought, distinctly different from that of the reference. Excuse me. For example, Homer employs a simile, indicated by bold type below, with an extended epic simile in the Iliad. Aeneas strode forth with threatening mien, and on the other side, the son of Peleus, Achilles, rushed against him, Aeneas, like a lion, a ravening lion, that men are fain to slay. Ellipsis, with glaring eyes, ellipsis, that attacks straight on in its fury. In the simile, the son of Peleus is the reference phrase, like is the explicit structure word of comparison, and a lion is the imaginative word for the concept to which the reference is compared. The underlying analogy is the same as that found in the discussion of analogy above. Achilles is to Aeneas as a lion is to an adversary. Metaphor, it always gets me, everyone gives this definition, metaphor, it seems so simple-minded, but fear not, I've made it more complex. All right. A metaphor lacks the explicit word or phrase of comparison found in a simile. Achilles is like a lion is a simile. Achilles is a lion is a metaphor. A metaphor is either evident or implied. Evident metaphor. An evident metaphor is an imaginative comparison found in the surface structure of a sentence, containing a reference word or phrase for the meaning of the metaphor, as well as an imaginative word or phrase from a different category, I'm not on it, sorry, from a different category of thought to which the metaphoric reference is compared on the basis of an underlying multi-term analogy. Achilles the lion is an evident metaphor consisting of a direct object and an appositive as illustrated in the following sentences. Achilles rushed forth to meet Aeneas. On Aeneas leapt Achilles, the lion. Achilles is the reference word, lion is the imaginative term. Implied metaphor. An implied metaphor is an imaginative comparison expressed in the surface structure of a sentence in which the imaginative word replaces a reference word from a different category of thought on the basis of a multi-term analogy, creating the compact riddle, where the reference of the imaginative word must be guessed at or recalled from a previous sentence. Hence, in the compound sentence, Achilles rushed to meet Aeneas, the lion sprang on Aeneas with fury. Achilles is the reference word and lion is the imaginative term, just as in the example of evident metaphor. In an implied metaphor, readers must discover that the word lion signifies Achilles, as well as appreciate the similar and different connotative associations between lion and Achilles. The implied metaphor is more condensed and less obvious than an evident metaphor, and even more condensed and less obvious than a simile. Tolkien comments that Kennings, compound metaphors, are used in Beowulf for condensation. Speaking of which, Kenning. Kennings are characteristic of Germanic verse, particularly Old Norse and Old English verse, but they are also found in other languages, such as Old Irish and Ancient Greek. Typically, a kenning is a compound metaphor. For example, in the sentence, Achilles rushed forth to meet Aeneas. On Aeneas leapt Achilles, the fury lion, or Fury's lion, or in modern English, lion of fury. The compound nouns fury lion and Fury's lion and lion of fury are metaphoric kennings. The phrase lion of fury exemplifies a type of compound noun phrase common in modern English, but not found in Old English, where the word of usually has the literal source meaning of from, out of, or source of origin, and is not a paraphrase of a genitive noun phrase such as Fury's lion, or a compound noun such as fury lion. Synecdoche. A synecdoche is a trope. Now we're getting perhaps to somewhat less familiar ground for some of us. A synecdoche is a trope in which a word for an entire entity, a complete person, place, object, action, or idea, is replaced by a word for a concept that is a part, component, or material substance of the entire entity. Or, more rarely, a synecdoche is the employment of a word signifying an entirety to stand for a part of it. For example, in a part for a whole, a ship can be called a sail, bark, or wood, whereas in a whole for a part, the Navy joined the party can mean a sailor or two in uniform arrived at the party. This last example of a whole representing a part would also be classified as the trope of hyperbole or extreme exaggeration. Metonymy. A metonymy is a trope in which something is referred to by a word for a closely related separate entity. For example, a thane might be called a spear or a sword, an author, a pen, examples of the lesser standing for the greater, and a marshal, the law, example of the greater substituting for or symbolizing the lesser. This may look something like what Aristotle looked like, which brings us to Aristotle. Somewhat surprisingly, in the Poetics and on Rhetoric, Aristotle discusses kennings, the most characteristic trope or imaginative turn of phrase in Old English or Old Norse verse. Of course, Aristotle does not use the term kenning, which is derived from Old Norse criticism. However, he cites genitive compound noun phrases by Greek poets as excellent examples of metaphor by analogy. So here, Here we have the calyx, a drinking bowl designed like this, so in a semi-reclining position, you can drink your wine and not spill it. Handles as well, stand. And now a top view of a drinking bowl. Here we have a hoplite soldier and the round shield, which notice resembles the drinking bowl. The adversary being defeated, Persian. Okay, and here we have a crouching soldier again behind the round shield. This is again a top view of this. In one example about a cup or wine bowl and a shield, Aristotle cites the source analogy and its metaphor, which are identified by bold type in the following text. The wine bowl is to Dionysus, the god of wine, as the shield to Ares, the god of war. So one can call the wine bowl Dionysius' shield, and the shield Ares' wine bowl. So I'm translating literally here so you can see the grammatical structure. In another example, Aristotle offers an analogy, and it's a metaphor about old age and evening. Old age is to life as evening to day. So one can call evening the day's old age, or like Empedocles, call old age the evening of life, or life's sunset, or life's evening would be more literal there. Translated into Old English or Old Norse, such genitive compound noun metaphors would be recognized as good examples of kennings by modern scholars of Old Scandinavian and Old English literature. Old English kennings. The typical surface structure of an Old English kenning is a compound noun phrase composed of two nouns, a determinant and a base. The first, or determinant noun, which helps to identify the actual reference of the kenning, is a metonymy or a synecdoche. The second noun, or base noun, is usually a metaphor, or less frequently, a second metonymy or a synecdoche. Most people prefer, just aesthetically, kennings that end in metaphors, in my experience. Neither one of the two nouns in a kenning directly names the reference of the kenning. In the manuscripts of Old English literature, ecclesiastical scribes usually wrote the two nouns in the compound noun kenning as one word, with the first determinate noun uninflected and the second base noun inflected for its surface role in the sentence. Now, the kenning of Lionel Benning should not be confused with the tunning of Eleanor Rumming. Please laugh. In translating Beowulf, Tolkien considers the kenning Swanrede from line 200. He explicates the meaning of the metaphorical kenning by discussing the analogy underlying it. Tolkien states that translating the words Swanrede as sea would lose too much. On the other hand, a full elucidation would take far too long. Literally, it means swan riding, that is the region that is to the swimming swan as the plain is to the running horse or rolling wagon. The Old English rad is, as a rule, used for the act of riding on a horse or in a wagon, or sailing in a ship, not as its modern descendant rode for a beaten track. This kenning may be the origin of the expression, the wain in Spain stays. Don't have to say please laugh. Okay. Furthermore, in On Translating, Tolkien observes that Old English poetry emphasizes compression of meaning through the use of kennings. He cites Anbad Beidru Runa, he unbound battle runes, as an example of a difficult hemistich, half-line to translate. In his Beowulf translation, Tolkien expands the phrase to spells by which men of wizardry could stir up storms in a clear sky, whereas he renders the hemistich as, quote, a spell to bring forth strife he loosed in his prose translation. Hence, based on Tolkien's suggestions, the analogy underlying the passage containing the kenning would be something like the following expression. He, the consort of Unferth, spoke sinister words to release strife as wizards of old cast spells to unbind the power of dark runes and bring storms to a clear sky. The kenning, he unbound battle runes, is similar to a kenning, he unlocked his word treasury. To him, the eldest, who is Beowulf, answered, the band's leader, he his word hoard unlocked, or treasury of diction unlocked, or extensive eloquence of speech expressed. Sorry, there it is there, in Old English. Okay, Old English Kennings. The analogy underlying the passage with the analogy underlying the passage with the kenning word hoard could be expressed as Beowulf revealed the eloquence of his diction as a king unlocks a treasure chest or treasure room to reveal his wealth. The tree diagrams in figures 1 and 2 are based on the case grammars of Charles Fillmore. Subsequent figures are simplified tree grammars of deep role analysis. There's Charles Fillmore, there he is as a fairly young man, contemplating his old himself receiving an award. Okay, so this is the syntactic model. It's more complex. It has a modality and a proposition, and then these, so the verb is always first, and then these are the deep cases, agent, place. And then to form an analogy, comparison, similarity, second sentence, and notice we replicate the act, agent, place. Okay, so that's, I think that's enough of that. Somewhat simpler is his later proposal for a semantic case grammar. So we just have proposition, and we have the underlying, here's the verb and the underlying cases. And this is dolphins swim in the sea as things right across running lines. So then a somewhat simpler teaching device, I think, might be useful, would be to just put it in the right word order. Okay, so this is just the kenning itself. So place kenning, referential agent economy, the dolphin, place metaphor, writing, or maybe the word lands or plains would be a better translation. Okay, so the surface structure and simplified deeper analysis of sea kenning, the dolphin writing for sea, of course. And here we, oh, it is a little different, this is good. Okay, so here we have a metonymic sword kenning. Okay, so we have a referential place, autonomy, and here we don't have a metaphor, we have another autonomy, the battle flash. Okay. And here would be the sentence, not an analogy, just a sentence. The sword flashes in battle. That underlies metonymic kenning. And here we have dolphins swim in the sea as horses gallop on the plains. And so in the surface structure word order, verbs probably do come first in deep structure. Not that anyone will ever know. unless they really get good at imaging brain waves. Okay, referential agent and autonomy, the horse, imagine place metaphor, the sea, the horse, sea for the land. And here's, of course, you get more than one possible analogy. Dolphins ride waves in the sea as things ride horses across the land, but also underline the place Kenning dolphin riding Beowulf line 10. Vikings sail ships across the sea as charioteers drive chariots across the land. So agent, act, undergoer, place, comparison, similarity, agent, act, undergoer, place. So we can have ship charioteers as a kenning for Vikings, or chariot Vikings as kenning for charioteer. Viking chariots for ships. Chariot ships for chariots. Charioteer ships for chariots. Viking planes for the sea. Ship planes for the sea. Charioteer seas for the lands. Chariot seas for lands. Word. Okay, so this is a little more interesting. Referential undergoer synecdoche, part for whole, word for language. Imaginative purpose metaphor, to reveal as hoard, to reveal as wealth or eloquence. Surface structure and simplified deep role analysis of purpose kenning, word hoard for wealth of language, eloquence. Beowulf 259. So that would be, Beowulf employed his words to display his eloquence as a king unlocks a chest to reveal his hoard, the underlying analogy. That's it. Okay. And so if you're interested in, I took all the footnotes, unlike a previous speaker who gave us a handout with all, two previous speakers gave us a handout with all the references. I took all my references out. So if you're interested in seeing this, I'll be glad to send it to you with data. Thank you. I forgot my last impersonation. Please clap.
Okay. Thank you. I'll do that. Okay, and if you'll both come back up here so we can ask you questions. I'm sure some people have them.
I have a question for Dr. Thornburg. That Fillmore's probe analysis, case analysis, would it work also with, could it be transferred to, like, for instance, semantic probes analysis, thematic probe analysis, would it be the same?
I think it has affinities, yes. Now, when he was in his syntactic form, he was just revising a standard transformational theory. And then later, a lot of his work was incorporated to a revised generative transformational ground. In his semantic, he was doing something, and it seems to me that the cases, and Fillmore suggested that you should keep a small number of cases, and so that various grammars have been proposed, and they went from like 4 cases to 10 or 11 cases. But then once you start listing all the cases that the linguists come up with, particularly in the field, when they're analyzing languages, there's more like 40 cases, you know, and I'm feeling there's probably more like 60 cases or 100 that might be useful. So I don't know if that would correlate well with.
I don't know. A case in English is kind of present day English. But the case, what do you mean this case is like
the deep cases, which would be universals.
Agent and
yes,
yes.
The universal And
Asian,
Yeah, in my experience-
diversity and,
yeah, they certainly work well for European languages, but they may work for Chinese too. And if that's the case, that's pretty good. Suggesting they're universals, you know. Which, I'm sorry, what was the term you used?
thematic roles.
Thematic roles, yeah. Also, I believe.
We have time for a few more questions.
I have a question for you. In showing these old Middle English manuscript mixed with Latin and some Old English phraseology, I wondered if, when you're reading it, since we have no idea how Latin sounded, how difficult it makes it that for analyzing and interpreting.
Well, first of all, it was Middle English and Latin that was mixed.
Oh, okay.
So, of course we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even know how Shakespeare is supposed to sound, let alone, going further back. And Latin sounded different with different people's accents because it was the medieval lingua franca. So that doesn't really, because what I am looking at is not how it sounds, but how it is presented on the page, and of course that is a reflection of how it could have sounded, how bilingual people would have potentially been speaking. That what I'm basically interested in, that it's syntactically okay to mix those languages together, even within one sentence. But of course we don't know how Middle English sounded. We have had hordes of historical linguists trying to figure it out, and we just have to kind of trust that they have come up with a good suggestion.
I just have to insert that my favorite stab at what Renaissance English sounded like was, it sounded like a drunken Irishman. English style. That brings up a question I had. So I've never noticed little red boxes. Are there other Middle English manuscripts with red boxes?
Yes, there are, and it's just one way of indicating that something is highly significant right now.
In some way.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, so it's like we underline, we highlight, we bold, whatever we do, yeah. So, yes, it is. But there were other means also, like underlining and writing in a different and yes. So very many. I went last summer, I went to the British Library to look at their Plowman manuscripts, and they're all doing it differently, but it is Latin that is usually somehow what I'm trying to do is to quantify it. Because it's just like, okay, Latin is marked, Latin is significant, and that's not enough for me. I would like to see, okay, let's quantify, how can we show that it really is significant.
May I follow, kind of jump in that?
Yes.
Do you think it might be a precursor too, since they seem to be biblical, and the scribes, the only educated people, were the priests and yada, 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 and we think
Yes.
there may be interpolations. Do you think that's a precursor to the King James Version, if it did that in later Bibles with the words of Christ printed in red?
Yes,
That kind
I
of thing.
believe it was part of the convention of marking something. Yes, absolutely. That's a very good analogy.
Yes.
Well, I have one that's very similar to this.
Yes.
These phrases that we see that are boxed
Yes.
in Piers Plowman, would these be phrases that the laity would recognize in Latin?
They wouldn't, I don't know. Probably not. But that's why in Piers Plowman very often the author paraphrases it in English.
Right.
Says it's in Latin and then it's not, he doesn't say, now I'm going to translate it, but
Right.
he summarizes the gist of the content.
Right.
Usually.
I was just, because I was looking at the quotation that you had pulled out, and I
Yes.
thought that those were probably things that the medieval hearing audience might recognize from sermons, because of course the Mass was all done in Latin.
Right, yes, the audience of Piers Plowman, darn, where's Adams when Adams could provide some, really good facts. But the audience is quite educated also, the ones who was reading.
They were or were not?
The reading
Yeah.
ones, yes,
Yes.
but not the hearing.
Yeah.
I mean, this may seem like another stupid question. I think, to analyze what you're trying to do in terms of a phraseology, it just would seem common sense that you don't want to do it in a vacuum. You want to look at, when and where they were saying it, the time frame, and what were the people talking about, and what were they doing, and how did they pick up these Latin words? Where did they come from? And obviously, it must have come from the Normans who came in through that area, or did they?
No,
No.
I don't think so. I
Okay.
don't think so.
So that's an important issue.
Yes, yeah, because, of course, because the Anglo-Saxon people before the 1300s that we're talking about, which is of course post-Norman conquest, the Anglo-Saxons were, as we know, highly educated. They were translating from Latin and so on, like Alfred.
Yeah, some critics say that the culture, Anglo-Saxon culture, was more sophisticated than Roman.
It was. I think it was just, and obviously, in the 1300s, people who were educated, like William Langland, who wrote Piers Plowman, would have been very fluent in that. So he was just going back and forth, but not with randomness. There is some kind of it's never predictable, but it's not random either. So there's content-wise, it was important. If you said it in Latin, then these isolated little unboxed Latin things, they were more like, we sometimes throw in, today's bilinguals throw in a word from another language. Yeah.
Sure.
So, yeah. So I speak Finnish with my family, and we throw in, because with Finnish Americans, we throw in an English word or phrase here and there, and sometimes summarize something in another language. So what I'm kind of like looking at is that it's not random. It's never predictable, because you can't predict what a person will say and in what register. Monolinguals also change registers when they speak. Sometimes it's more formal, sometimes it's less formal. And what I'm trying to look at is that bilingualism follows certain universals. We don't know what the universals are, but it is something that has to do with being a human. This is how we mix languages, and it's not random.
Right, it's not.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be.
Since I know nothing about medieval manuscripts, you did say that the rubrification was basically, it wasn't as the scribe was writing it, but it was basically contemporary with the production of the manuscript. Was it something that 50 years later somebody came back and said, oh, gee, let's go mark all the Latin phrases here?
I don't know, because there are about 50 plus manuscripts of Piers Plowman. So how that happened and what the difference, the scribes probably, they were like, our IT people, hey, can you do this PowerPoint for me or something? So here's what I've written. So So if you could do the rubrication there, and sometimes they have left spaces like for illustrations, and then the illustrator does that.
So that leads into my question,
Yes.
were the rubricators educated at the same level as the scribe?
Probably not. Sometimes they might have been.
Because I don't know, is it silly to question if they knew they were supposed to box something and read on that line, but maybe they didn't know, did they read? Did they know the difference between
and
the Middle English and the Latin?
Yes, and that was actually one of my questions, because in the manuscript R, it's very mechanical. If there's a plus, then the whole line has been boxed. But
Right.
then the other manuscript, it seems that he has been paying more attention what actually is Latin.
Right.
But I think all the rubricators, they would have known.
They should have.
Literate, so,
Right.
so it is interesting that it's not identical. But you know, if it were identical, then we wouldn't have any speculations about these different. What is the you know.
Well, I agree that there's certainly purpose to it, but then on the other hand, my mind was thinking, you can spend all this time on trying to figure out why, one did it this way and the other, and then it can just be that particular rubricator couldn't tell the difference for some reason between the Latin and the Middle English, and so he just boxed the line.
Boxed everything. That's a good point. That's
It also could have been lazier.
Lazy, yeah. A fly on the wall of that particular rubricator.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
And certainly what one person thought of as a common expression like mea culpa, another person, not that expression, but another person might have thought, oh, that's kind of unusual, I better box around it.
Yes.
We'll see.
Yes, and this is a long-term future project. To find out what the other manuscripts are doing, but of course the electronic archives makes it kind of easy.
So when the rubricator is putting the square boxes around, he has a manuscript that's been written that it doesn't have any boxes, and it has little pluses on it. Does he also have an earlier manuscript that he's looking at?
Well, we don't know.
No,
We don't know. Yeah, and it's because there are these three different A, B, and C versions, and they all follow. Sometimes they resemble each other much more, and it seems like then the person is just copying, and then some people are adding something. Where are they adding from? What is the whole big thing is what was Langland's original, which we don't know. What was his intention?
One question for Dr. Thornburg has to do, this is maybe just an obvious statement, but a lot of the examples that you were giving, virtually all of them were for metaphors and analogies were all just sort of one or two phrases or things like this, but the point I think ought to be made that the whole books were analogies. Sometimes entire poems were analogies, and oftentimes, if you look at the Plato's analogy, for example, there's so. My point is that I agree with everything that you said. It's just that you need to not just talk about it in terms of one or two words.
Well, like the analogy from Homer, we can find the simile and get a nice small simile, but it goes on, simile. But the basic underlying deep cases, the universal, the sort of like an extended analogy is just building on the theme, so you could have like a master analogy then that could govern a paragraph, a chapter, a book.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. Thank
thank you everyone for coming, and I believe we have a break now until the magical singers.